So at this point, there is, I guess, finally an effort to organize the opposition to Germany in the wake of all of its aggression. So the Grand Alliance is a significant alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the U.S., but also 24 other countries that are opposed to Germany's aggression. And what's important about the Grand Alliance is that they adopt what's called the Europe First policy. And, since this is European history, we are focusing primarily on the European theater of the war. But of course, we are aware of the fact that there's also a Pacific theater, and that Japan obviously is a major aggressor and an enemy of the United States, Britain, and France as well. But what the Europe First policy basically says is that the Grand Alliance is going to make sure that they secure victory in Europe before they move on to do anything in the Pacific. This is also important because, as we just discussed in the last slide, it was the Japanese that attacked the U.S. in Pearl Harbor. But because Germany declared war on the U.S. Just a few days after the Pearl Harbor attack, according to the Europe First policy, the U.S. and all the allies were basically going to target their attention against Germany and not Japan. So at this point, Germany has established control over basically all of Western Europe, with the exception of Switzerland and Sweden, which remain neutral, as you can see here. So basically, Germany controlled Austria, Czechoslovakia, Western Poland, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, and Western Russia. So they've established a huge empire in Europe. Even these other areas that we see in lighter red, they are influenced. They are dependent states on Nazi Germany, even if they were not directly controlled by the Nazis. So what the Nazi government does is it establishes, or it attempts at least to establish totalitarian rule over all of their occupied territories. And this totalitarian rule is referred to historically as the New Order. So essentially what you see is that countries that had more blood connections to ethnic Germans, like Nordic peoples, okay, so the Dutch, the Norwegians, and the Danes, they were actually treated in a slightly more relaxed way because they were seen as closer ethnically to the Germans. The French, however, were seen as, quote, inferior to the Germans, so they actually experienced heavier taxes when they were controlled by the Nazis. And then, of course, as we know, the Slavic population, they were seen as subhuman. Hitler wanted to enslave them and basically force them to die out and then resettle the lands that they used to live in. So what you actually saw was that you had a bunch of Slavic peoples actually essentially work as unpaid laborers. A lot of them were transported to Germany from Poland, from the Soviet Union, to do a lot of heavy backbreaking work, and about 80% of these people actually did not survive the war. So the New Order was, just kind of this way of ruling over all these territories that were controlled by the Nazis, but treating people differently based on their nationality and their ethnicity. We already know that this also was a period of severe genocide against anyone that was not Aryan. Most notably, of course, the genocide against the Jews. About 6 million Jews were killed during this period, but also Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals were also killed during this time, right? We know that basically, the victims of this genocide were, at first, the Jews were forced to, at first, live in ghettos in Poland once it was occupied by Germany. But eventually, this no longer sufficed, and Hitler turned towards his, quote, final solution, where he expelled the Jews to death camps, and Auschwitz is the most notorious of all of these. So about 6 million Jews, which was approximately 2/3 of the pre-war Jewish population, was killed off in the Holocaust, and then about 5 to 6 million others were killed as well. So important turning points in the war. We're first going to talk about Stalingrad, and you can see Stalingrad here, an industrial city along the Volga River. So Stalingrad is important. The winter of 1942, 1943, it's a significant land defeat by the Germans in Europe. All right, so the Germans at this point, this was well into the German invasion of the Soviet Union. As we know, the Soviets were becoming increasingly nationalistic against the Germans. All right, and so the Soviets actually in Stalingrad are going to surround the Germans, but Hitler's going to refuse to surrender. And because Hitler refuses to surrender, about 300,000 Germans are killed in the Battle of Stalingrad. All right, and then after the Germans are defeated at Stalingrad, the Soviets finally start to push the German army back to Berlin. So you can see all these retreat lines. This is sort of the extent to which the Germans make it into Russia, and they're not able to get past Stalingrad here. So this is a huge turning point because finally the Germans are defeated by land in Stalingrad. In Africa, we have the Battle of El Alamein, which is down here in Egypt. All right, so the Germans actually were occupying Egypt as well. And the Battle of El Alamein in November of 1942, let me get back here actually, is significant because the British actually are able to successfully drive the Germans out of Egypt. One of the reasons why the English are successful in getting the Germans out was because the Germans were also preoccupied with their invasion of the USSR. So because the Germans didn't shift all of their attention to defeating Britain in the Mediterranean, they didn't really have enough numbers to be victorious against the British in the Mediterranean. The campaign to drive the Germans out of Egypt was known as, or out of Egypt and North Africa, is referred to as Operation Torch. And basically what happened was the U.S. and the British, they actually first land their forces on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, as we can see here. And what they were doing was they were actually engaging all these German forces who had retreated from El Alamein. Okay, so they were defeated, and all the Germans were going this way. Oops, sorry. So all the Germans were going this way, and the U.S. and British soldiers actually basically landed in Morocco and Algeria and then took on the German retreating soldiers here. They were already weak, and they were basically defeated by the U.S. and British by May of 1943. And it's important because when the Allies secure victory in North Africa in the summer of 1943, this also gives them the confidence they need to invade Italy. All right, because now they have this, they are basically occupying this entire region to Italy's south. So that's huge. All right, so so important for us to realize the victories in different parts of the front. So Stalingrad is an important eastern turning point, southern turning point, El Alamein, and Operation Torch. A significant northern turning point is D-Day or Operation Overlord. This is the summer of 1944. All right, so again, it's important for us to realize that if it had not been for the British successfully repelling the Germans during the Battle of Britain, D-Day might not have been possible, right? Because D-Day was launched from the UK, right, across the English Channel. So at this point, of course, northern France was occupied by the Germans, and so what D-Day is it's an amphibious assault on Normandy. All right, so they're going across the English Channel, right? They send 120,000 Allied troops across the English Channel to basically defeat the Germans and insinuate their retreat back to Germany. All right. Partly because you, of course, have the U.S. involved in this assault, as well as the fact that at this point you already had a serious defeat in Stalingrad and in El Alamein. D-Day is a success on the part of the Allies, right? Basically, what this shows us is that Nazi domination in Europe is going to steadily decline. A month after D-Day, Paris is going to be liberated from Nazi occupation. And then what Hitler is going to find is that he's essentially fighting a war on three fronts, which is far worse than he had ever anticipated. On the west, he's fighting a front against the U.S. and Britain and France, which is what we're looking at right here. We know that there was also the Eastern Front, which we discussed when we talked about Stalingrad, and there's also essentially a southern front as well along North Africa. So this kind of three-front war is basically going to spell out German defeat. Also, by the fall of 1944, you're going to see that the Allied troops are actually going to reach the German border. So you see how after D-Day, ultimately they're going to keep pushing east towards Germany. Once the Allied troops reach the German border, they prepare to invade Germany, and the end seems near. The one kind of exception to the rule here is the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. This is Hitler's last attempt to drive the Allies away from the Western German border. And the Battle of the Bulge actually results in casualties on both sides. But despite the fact that Hitler was able to at least temporarily keep the Allies outside of Germany, after the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies quickly penetrate deep into Germany in 1945, and basically the end is near at this point. Hitler ends up committing suicide several days before Germany surrenders, but Germany surrenders in May 8th of 1945. But then the war continues in the Pacific Theater. And again, unfortunately, we're not going to really focus on that too much, but it's important for us to realize that the war officially ends in August of 1945 with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, which results in unconditional Japanese surrender. All right, so results of the war, very devastating casualty-wise. Remember the casualty rates of World War II? We were talking 10 million, 12 million or so. Look at these escalated numbers compared to World War I. 55 million casualties, 22 million in the USSR alone. The Holocaust itself resulted in about 12 million casualties. Remember, about half of those people were Jewish. And you also just saw millions of people, if they didn't die, they were left homeless or were forced to relocate. You had a lot of Germans who ended up living outside of Germany. So, I mean, ultimately, just the sheer, I guess, disruption to people's way of life was also a significant result of the war. Also, just the sheer physical devastation of Europe. You see here, this is a typical example of a bombed city, right? So it's going to take years to rebuild Europe after just the physical damage that was done to all these cities. You saw women play a much greater role in the wartime economy than in World War I. All right, part of this is because between the two wars, you saw women gain more political rights. Women in most countries had the right to vote by the late 1920s. And so women, because of their greater political clout, are also going to be significant in joining the ranks of the workforce, in entering college in greater numbers than ever before. The great world powers that emerge from World War II are going to be the US and USSR. And of course, the competition for influence over Europe after the war is over is going to be one of the primary reasons why the Cold War begins. So important for us to just ask the question, and there are many answers to this question, why the Germans ultimately lost the war. We already discussed earlier that one of the reasons is geography, right? The Germans ultimately end up fighting a three-front war by the end, a front in the east, right, where they're pressing into the Soviet Union. Again, a huge mistake for the Germans to invade the Soviet Union. Most historians would agree. You have the Western Front in France, and of course, after the launch of D-Day, the Western Front proves disastrous for the Germans. And then you have a Southern Front as well along North Africa and Italy, right? And once the Allies are able to invade Italy after they successfully gain back North Africa, this is going to spell the end for the Germans there as well. The Germans also are just going to be sort of overreaching themselves because of not only the three-front war, but because basically the German army is spread out over the entire continent of Europe. They're eventually going to end up running out of soldiers. And you're going to find that towards the later stages of the war, the German army is even going to be recruiting young boys and old men as soldiers. So they become rather desperate. Another huge mistake was that Germany allowed Britain to remain intact after the Battle of Britain. Of course, this ensures that Britain will remain sort of a launching point for the D-Day invasion, so that's huge. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a huge mistake, and engaging the Soviet army in Stalingrad proved disastrous for Germany. You're going to see that since Germany declared war immediately after Pearl Harbor, this was a huge mistake because of the Europe First campaign. The U.S. ends up focusing on Germany instead of Japan. Huge mistake for the Germans. The Allies also industrially outproduced the Axis significantly. All right, the Allies bombed lots of German cities and destroyed factories, so the Germans could not keep up militarily. The Germans did use slave labor like Slavs and Jews, but this was not very effective. And they spent way too much of their economic energy on their final solution in the Holocaust. And also, they don't shift their economy into a total war until 1943, and at that point, it was sort of too late. Also, their alliances were sort of a liability, right? Italy ends up failing militarily in Greece and Yugoslavia, and that distracts the Germans. We're going to just spend one more